Guys, gals, you ever seen one of these things before? These might be the worst piece of technology ever invented. Hello and welcome to the channel, everyone. I've wanted to make this video for a long time because fax machines are the devil. You thought printers were the devil? No, it's the fax machine. For those of you who don't know me, which is all of you, I come from an IT background, and I'm going to have to explain to you how this works in order for you to understand why faxing is so miserably fucking awful. Now, just to put this into perspective, this thing is older than the telephone. So in order to understand, you got to understand how phones work. Okay, so here we have our handy dandy notebook, and this is how it works. So over here, you have a phone. This phone sends a letter. Literally. It sends a letter to this phone. That's how that works. Now, within this letter is a bunch of information that the phone understands. And one of the things that it does is it says, I speak English. Not literally, but you know, we're going to use English as the example here. So it says, I speak English. And we decide, cool, English is what we're going to talk in. And this is our codec establishment in English. That's how you spell English. That's codec establishment, basically. Really basically. So we decide, hey, we're going to speak English now. So basically what this boils down to is the phones understand how they're going to communicate. And there's a lot of mechanisms underneath how all this stuff works that I might have to get into to explain how bad faxing is. But basically when it comes to real-time communications, you first send this letter, and this letter's like, cool, I got that letter, and everything's great, okay? The phones then start to communicate back and forth, and they send different kinds of data. Okay, so now that we kind of understand how a phone works, sort of, now I want you to imagine you call up your friend, and you're like, hey, I'm looking at this picture over here. I'm going to describe what this picture looks like, and I want you to reproduce that perfectly on the other side. Now, your first initial thought might be, well, they're machines. Of course they can just talk back and forth to each other, and then it'll just work, right? And that's where you would be wrong. Because remember the last time you called your friend up, which was probably like 10 years ago, because nobody does that anymore, and you were talking to him on the phone, and it cut out for a second, and you didn't hear what they said? Yeah, the same thing happens with the fax machine. So you have these two robots trying to describe a picture to each other using actual phone calls. That's how it works nowadays. So if you ever get a fax, and you're like, damn, this looks like shit. Yeah, that's because one robot couldn't hear what the other robot was saying, and so it had to fill in the gaps with whatever it thinks it would have gotten. Now, that's all well and good, right? Stuff doesn't always work as we would want it to, right? Fine. Phones sometimes have garbled audio. You know, sometimes you try to call someone, you don't have service, like things don't work, right? It gets so much worse. So normally, when phones communicate that letter to each other, that letter has a bunch of information that the other phone basically picks. This thing says, here are the things that I support. I support these codecs here. This phone will then respond, more or less, this is how it works, saying, I'll choose this one. And that is how the data will then flow between the two. They will use an encoder to transfer the bits and the data so that you can hear audio. With a fax machine, well, no one likes to fucking use them, so the standards in the industry are basically non-existent. And so we have our fax machine. Maybe I'll draw like a real fax machine this time. I am not an artist, as you may have just discovered. This is a fax machine, I guess. That's a printer or something. That's a paper shredder. I don't know what that is, but that's a fax machine. It sends this letter. Well, it's actually not how it works, because this thing is old as fuck. Right? Old. Very old. Definitely old enough to drink. These machines were never digitized, if that makes sense. These are analog. These things are old as fuck, okay? So you actually don't have fax machine sending letter to other fax machine. That is not how that works. And to be clear, we've digitized what a fax machine does. We just still use the fax machine itself. And that's because of a lot of stupid reasons. But anyway, you have your fax machine here. And then that's connected to this other device. And this thing transfers the analog signal into a digital signal, zeros and ones. So this takes this sine wave dealy, and it changes it into that. Okay? That thing then communicates with one on the other side, which is then connected to a fax machine. You with me so far? We've already made this twice as complicated as just sending a fucking phone call. So we're gonna do this. This is an F. Oh god. This is what do they actually? I forget what they call these fucking things. An ATA. Whatever, bro. So let's just replace our fax machines with these ATA devices instead that are digital. So it says, I want to speak this language, right? We basically get that data. This turns it into digital data, sends it across the internet to this one, and this one looks at that. It looks at the thing, and it's like, that's not for me, and it just fails. So that can happen with phone calls, but you have that in the mix. So you send the thing, and it's just like, nah. Now, more than likely, one of the problems that you could run into. One of the problems that you could run into is that you send this letter, and this letter says, I want to use fax stuff. I want to use T38. It's an old way to process fax data. And this side says, no, I don't accept that. And then it fails. Sometimes, depending on the configuration of both sides, which you only have control over this side. So it might work. It might work. It might not fucking work. Now, another part of this shit show, which is always in the mix, are the carriers. So you have, oh, that's big. Carrier, I'd change the brush size. You have a carrier. Well, when your phone makes a phone call, or your fax machine in this case, it goes out to the carrier first. And then the carrier will send it to, let's go this way. The carrier will send it to the destination. Jesus, this is hard. Okay, that's how that works. So in a lot of cases, you'll have a carrier that you're communicating with, and you send that letter to that carrier. And the carrier themselves are like, oh, you want to speak this? You want to speak this fax machine language? No. And they're the ones that send that 488 or some other error response. Doesn't even need to be the end side. Could just be the carrier. Because nobody has any standards. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean it will fail. So if we redraw this in a way that doesn't suck, what can happen is you send your initial letter that has now been digitized, and you say T38. That's really weird to do sideways. Okay, so you're sending this letter for T38. This thing then responds, this carrier in this case, says, fuck that, faxing sucks. So what you can do, you can configure this to go, okay, try again for something else. That is a thing that you can do, but it requires you to configure it that way if your machine can even be configured that way. Okay, now assuming that this insane bullshit does work, hopefully you can see most of what I'm doing here. I know my face is covering some of it, but assuming all that shit works perfectly, well, now you have a phone call established between these two fax machines. And this fax machine over here, he's speaking at like 100 words a second, right? He's like, I'm super fast, wee. Sends it over there. And this guy's like, yo, you're speaking too fucking fast. Slower. I don't usually use a mouse to write things, that's why I suck at it. But it's like, okay, send it slower. And this one, again, is like, okay, I'll send it at like 95. And then again, the other one's like, that's too fast. And the cycle repeats until they reach a baud rate that they both accept. And a baud rate is just, it's a transfer rate. But then there's the other scenario where I'm speaking really fast, super duper fast, super fast. And you tell me to slow down. You're like, yo, dude, slow the fuck down. Right? You're like, slow the fuck down. And so I slow down, but I keep going a little bit too fast for you. And you're like, slow the fuck down again. You probably can't see that anymore, but yeah, you know. Slow down, and we just keep trying to slow me down. And you know what? I'm on crack or something. I'm just going a million miles an hour, and I can't slow down. I'm the fastest fax machine you ever heard of, dude. and I'm just going to keep sending. I'm just going to keep sending this, even though they're slower and slower. You're still really old because you're from the 1800s, and well, that should be a 4. You know, it's old as shit. And so it eventually just goes, I'm done. And it fucking fails. You don't have these problems even just making a phone call. You gotta understand, like, there's problems, and I'm not gonna get into like networking issues when it comes to like making phone calls and stuff, but it's not this complicated to make it fucking work. Eventually it gets to this transfer rate that they can both establish, because one was like, hey, I'm speaking English really fast. Can you understand what I'm saying? I want you to draw this picture for me, thanks. And the other guy's like, yo, 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 please slow down. I need to speak at this speed, okay? And then I'll retrain myself, and I'm like, okay, can you understand me now? And once you get past all this fucking shit, you are still on a fucking phone call. Now, you guys ever wondered, why is it that when I send an email, it all gets received and not like half of it gets received? Well, that's because of the way that the information is transferred. That uses TCP, okay? It'll all get there. This uses UDP. It's a different transfer protocol, and the way that TCP works is you send a packet, you send a letter, it gets there, and it's marked by like 1. So on the other side, it says, I got number 1. It like knows, it increments it. And so then number 2 gets sent, and so on. And then it gets a number 2. If at some point along the line here, one of these doesn't get sent, it gets resent. So if I didn't get number 3, let's say, go back to this one, if I didn't get number 3, I'll resend number 3 basically forever until you acknowledge I got number 3, and then I'll send number 4. That's why you get the whole fucking email. With a fax machine, these two robots are now on a phone call, literally on a phone call, trying to describe to each other what a picture looks like. So if any of these packets get dropped because you're talking to your friend and then for a second and then you really hear what they say, yeah, that shit's lost. That's gone. You're never going to get that information back. So when I was saying put a dot here, it didn't hear me. And it didn't hear me here, and it didn't hear me here. And so it looks like shit. And so the moral of the story here is that faxing fucking sucks. And I didn't even go over all the possible ways where this can fail before the call even gets established. It is so miserably bad at a job that is so much easier if you could just send an email. So the moral of the story here, folks, is stop using a fax machine. Just stop. You'll be okay. The world will continue spinning, and I promise you, there are things out there that are more secure, that cost less money and less frustration. And that's going to be the end of the video. So fuck faxing and have a nice day.